The second element in a contract is consideration. Consideration is the thing of value that induces a party to enter into a contract. In other words, consideration is the value given in return for a promise. During this block, we have 5 learning objectives. First, to define consideration. 2, to list the rules regarding consideration. 3, to describe what promissory estoppel is and when it can be used. 4, to define an illusory promise. And 5, to describe the concept of accord and satisfaction. Let's discuss the elements of consideration. Element number 1 is legal value. 3 things constitute legal value. First, a promise to do what one has no prior legal duty to do. The emphasis here is on prior legal duty. For example, if you're a police officer and you're in the post office doing your postal business, and you look up and you happen to see a wanted poster, $25,000 for information leading to the arrest of Black Bart. You don't think too much about it. You continue your business. You leave the post office. As you're leaving, you notice this guy walking down the street. Guess who it is? Black Bart. So what do? You pull out your gun. You hit him in the back of the head. You then throw him in the trunk of your car and you drive to the closest precinct. You take Black Bart to the desk sergeant, you turn him over into his custody, and you ask for your $25,000 reward. Question: would you be entitled to that reward? Answer: no. Why? Because you had a prior legal duty to arrest Black Bart. You were a police officer. You were paid to arrest criminals. Now, had you not been a cop and you took Black Bart into custody, you would have been entitled. Why? Because you had no prior legal duty. Number 2, the performance of an action that one is not otherwise obligated to undertake. Now, the key word here is obligated. When you see obligation, the duty tends to be based on a relationship. If you were married and your husband or wife offered you $1,000 to feed their children, and you fed those children, would you be entitled to the money? The answer is no. Why? Because you had a parental obligation to feed your children. You were obligated to do it. Now, if we change this up just a little bit, let's say you are an au pair, a babysitter, hired to watch the children. If the parent said to you, I will give you $1,000 to feed my children, and you fed them, you would be entitled to that money. Why? You were not obligated to feed them. Finally, number 3, the refraining from an action that one has a legal right to undertake constitutes as something of legal value. Basically, this is just promising not to do something that you could do. Let's say you had a Citroen Maserati. Beautiful, beautiful car. Your favorite color is bubblegum pink. I hate bubblegum pink. I offer to pay you $2,000 not to paint your car. If you agreed not to paint your car pink, and you did not paint your car pink, you'd be entitled to that money. Why? Because you're refraining from an action, painting your car, that you have a legal right to undertake. second element to consideration is bargained for exchange. The consideration given by the promisor must induce the promisee to incur legal detriment, and the detriment incurred must induce the promisor to make the promise. Now, in case you're not aware, the promisor is the offeror, the promisee is the offeree. The promisor makes the promise, the offeree accepts or rejects the promise. Now, the only thing that makes this statement a little bit tricky is the consideration given by the promisor must induce the promisee to incur legal detriment. Legal detriment is a tricky term. Why? Because when we think of something as being a detriment, we think of it as being harmful. But a legal detriment is not a harm, it's a lost opportunity. Now, basically, the promisor is offering to do something for the promisee or to give something to the promisee in exchange for a payment. For example, in the picture you see, the promisor is the seller offering to sell the painting to the customer for $3. Now, the consideration given by the promisor, the painting, induces the promisee to incur a legal detriment. What's the legal detriment? The loss of the $3. The detriment incurred must induce the promisor to make the promise. What does that mean? Why is the promisor promising to sell the painting? Because the promisor wants the $3, right? The legal detriment is the loss of the opportunity by the promisee to use that money, to use that $3 for anything else. Critical point. The element of bargain for exchange distinguishes contracts from gifts. I'm going to say this one more time because this is critical. The element of bargain for exchange distinguishes contracts from gifts. A gift is something for nothing. You just give that to a person because you want to. They did not do anything at all to receive the gift. By contrast, a contract is something for something, something for something. The grocer is giving the customer the food because the customer is giving the grocer the money. Now, the real big difference between the two is that contracts are enforceable and gifts are not. I'm going to say this again. Contracts are enforceable, but gifts are not. Why? Because there's no consideration with a gift. Something for nothing is just a nice thing to do. Something for something is a contract and it poses a duty on each party. Now, I've got a real big caveat here, real big exception to this rule. Charitable donations are enforceable gifts. Charitable donations are enforceable gifts. The reason for this is charities depend on those gifts to operate. If you fail to meet your pledge, if you fail to give the gift to the charity that you promised, the charity could be in breach of contract because you failed to give them what you said you would. Legal sufficiency and adequacy of consideration. Adequacy of consideration refers to the fairness of a bargain. As a general rule, courts will not evaluate the adequacy of consideration. Courts will not look to see whether the bargain was fair, as a general rule. The exception occurs when the consideration is so grossly inadequate as to shock the consciousness of the court, so as to imply fraud, duress, or undue influence. Now, an example of grossly inadequate consideration, gross to the point where it shocks the consciousness of the court, would be, let's say you had a house that was valued at $5 million, and you sold it to me for $5,000. And then you sued to get the house back. Well, the amount of money that I paid for the house is so grossly inadequate, so grossly out of line with the actual value of the house, that in the eyes of the courts, right, it would imply that I committed fraud, duress, or I had undue influence over you to make you give up so much money. Now, notice the key is grossly inadequate, not simply inadequate. If you had a house that was valued at $5 million and you sold it to me for $2.5 million, that's half the value of the house. That would be inadequate, but it is not grossly inadequate. Why? Because you could justify selling a $5 million house for $2.5 million. Let's say you need the money now. But how could anyone justify selling a $5 million house for $5,000? You just couldn't. It doesn't make sense. So the courts would look into that to see if there was fraud, duress, or undue influence. Now, there are some contracts that lack consideration. First, we start off with a pre-existing duty. Under most circumstances, a promise to do what one already has a legal duty to do is not legally sufficient consideration, because no legal detriment or benefit has been incurred or received. However, as with all things in the law, there are exceptions. Exception number one, unforeseen difficulties. When a party to a contract runs into unforeseen and substantial difficulties that could not have been anticipated at the time the contract was entered into, the parties may agree to extra compensation for overcoming the difficulties, and a court will generally enforce the agreement. These difficulties do not include risks ordinarily assumed in business. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to the highlighted words, unforeseen and substantial. When something is unforeseen, that means it's something you could not have known about. When something is substantial, that means it's big, it's major. These difficulties do not include risks ordinarily assumed in business. In almost every business relationship, there are some inherent risks. Think about when you buy stocks. Is there a possibility that you could lose money? Yes, that's a risk because the markets go up and down, right? So that's a risk ordinarily assumed in business. Now, for me, a real big example is, let's say you hired some lumberjacks to get $100,000 worth of pine wood for you. As they were in the field chopping down the trees, all of a sudden you had a tornado. Because of the tornado, they could not continue to chop the trees down, not without special equipment and probably extra compensation. Now, here's the thing. Is a tornado something that is foreseeable? The answer is no. Is getting blown away by a tornado while chopping trees down a risk ordinarily assumed in business? The answer is no. right? That would be an unforeseen difficulty for which extra consideration would be required to induce someone to fulfill the contract. Rescission and a new contract. Two parties can agree to rescind their contract, at least to the extent that it is executory. When rescission and the make of a new contract take place at the same time, the majority of the courts will enforce the new promise. The rescission must be express. Now let's talk about this. Two parties can agree to rescind a contract at least to the extent that it is executory. Now I'm sure you remember an executory contract is an open contract. It's one in which either one or both parties have yet to do everything they promised to do. Now, you can't rescind a contract, you can't cancel a contract on the portion that's already complete. You can only cancel what has not yet been done. Now, in some circumstances, when you rescind a contract, you have to enter into a new contract. Now, if you rescind a contract and you enter into a new contract, courts honor the new contract. Why? Because both of the parties agreed to cancel the earlier contract. Now, last one, then I'm going to come back to number 2. The rescission must be expressed. There is absolutely no such thing as an implied rescission. It must be expressed. Now, rescission can be oral or in writing. It depends on, first, the form that the original contract was in. If the original contract was oral, the rescission and the new contract can be oral. If the original contract was in writing, both the rescission and the new contract must be in writing. Let's say you hired me as a general contractor to build a house for you. We went over the plans. You told me the design that you wanted, right? It was a 3-bedroom ranch style home, 2.5 baths, pretty standard master suite, ensuite restroom. After construction has begun, but before it's completed, your spouse brings her mother over to check out the house. She goes in the bedroom. Oh, this is a lovely design, but I think you should design the bathroom like this. So your spouse gets back to me and says, I want the bathroom to include a whirlpool bathtub and a Shepherd standing shower. Now, this was not in the plan. We had a standard bathroom with a bathtub. So you say, okay, I haven't gotten that far along. We can do this. The next week, you come with your father. And your father has some great ideas for the kitchen design. So you come to me and say, look, I know that we asked for a standard kitchen, but I think I want to bump the kitchen out. I want to make it 5 feet larger because I want to accommodate an island. And I say, okay, wait a minute. These two changes that you've made, the change to the bathroom, the change to the kitchen, right? This is not what we agreed to, and it's going to add to the cost of building the house. Now, if you want me to do this, we have to enter into a new agreement with these changes. Now, if you don't want to enter into this agreement, we're going to go and build the house that we initially agreed to with no changes at all. You say, no, 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 I really want the bathroom and the kitchen the way I want them. Let's make this happen. So what do? We cancel the initial contract that we had to build the house to the extent that it's not been executed. So the framing, or actually the foundation's already been done, right? We're in the process of framing. So we cancel the contract for the framing and we enter into a new contract, right, for the new home. Let's say the original house cost $300,000. With the changes, it's going to cost $335,000. All right. Now, what will the courts do? Because we agreed to cancel that initial contract, the courts will honor the second contract. Now, as I'm sure you remember, contracts dealing with interest in real property are one of those contracts that had to be in writing to be enforceable. That means this original contract was in writing, So that means that the rescission of the contract must be in writing, signed by both parties. And the new contract, the changes to the house, must also be in writing, signed by both parties. Past consideration. Promises made with respect to events that have already taken place are unenforceable because they lack the element of bargained for exchange. Okay, let's say that 15 years ago I started a company and you were my first employee. For 10 years, we worked side by side, day and night. You were doing all of the things I couldn't figure out to do. You were my go-to person. But as always happens, you decided after finding your true love to leave me, to leave the company, to go get married and start a family. Well, based on what you did, I kept on working, and 5 years passed and I have an IPO, and now I'm worth $75 billion. I'm richer than I ever hoped to be, and as I was sitting reflecting on my newfound wealth, I thought about all the little people who helped me get where I am. You came to mind. So I called you up and I said, you know what, because of what you did with me over the 10 years you worked with me, I'm now really, really rich and I want you to be rich too. So I'm going to send you a check for $10 million. And you say, thank you, Mr. Claire. And you hang up, I hang up, and I go back to partying with all my really good friends. 2 weeks go by, you haven't heard from me. So you decide to give me a call. You say, Mr. Claire, you said that you were going to give me $10 million for the work that I put in with you because you wanted me to share in your success. And I say, who is this? And you tell me who you are, and I hang up the phone and I just start laughing. You get upset and you decide to sue me for breach of contract. Would you win? The answer is definitely no. Why? Because when you work for me, I paid you. What do I owe you now? Nothing. That $10 million would have been a gift, and guess what? Gifts are unenforceable. Next promise that lacks consideration is an illusory promise. If a contract expresses such uncertainty of performance that the promisor has not actually promised to do anything, the promise is illusory, without consideration, and unenforceable. If I were to say to you, let's say you guys are my workers, we have a factory. If performance improves to my satisfaction, I will give each of you a 10% bonus. Is that a good promise? The answer should be no, because what is my satisfaction? That's uncertain. It sounds like I'm promising to do something, but I'm really not. If your performance improves by 50%, I'm not satisfied because I think you could have got 51. If it improves by 100%, I'm not satisfied because I think you could have got 110. Right? I'm not actually promising to do anything, right? So it's without consideration and it's unenforceable. Now, to be really honest, right, what must an offer have? Reasonably certain and definite terms. Now, if I were to say to you, if performance improves by 20%, I will give you a 5% bonus. Would that be good? The answer is yes. Why? I'm telling you exactly what you have to do and exactly what you're going to get. Those terms are definite. That would be good. Ooh. Now, we have to talk about the settlement of claims. These are also contracts that lack consideration, but they are enforceable. Now, the methods of settling claims include an accord and satisfaction. An accord and satisfaction is a contract law concept about the purchase of the release from a debt obligation. The accord is the agreement to discharge the obligation. The satisfaction is the execution of the accord. You see this a lot with loan collection agencies, right, or credit collection agencies, right? You may have a borrower who has a debt of $10,000 outstanding, right? It goes into collection. So the debt collection agency calls them up and says, look, you owe us $10,000. If you give us $6,000, right, that will satisfy your debt. You will be debt free. Now, if you agree to pay $6,000 for that $10,000 debt, that would be the accord. When you actually pay the $6,000, that would be the satisfaction or the execution of the accord. Now, a question you might have is, why would anybody enter into this type of an agreement? Well, one of the things we know about debt is the older the debt is, the less likely you are to collect on it. So the debt collection agencies figure they'd rather get something than nothing, right? So they allow you to purchase the debt for a lower price. Next, we have a release. A legal release is a legal instrument that acts to terminate any legal liability between the releasor and the releasee, signed by the releasor. Now, in some circumstances, releases can be oral. A real easy example of a release is you're driving down the street, somebody hits the back end of your car. Call that a fender bender, right? When you get out, you see that your bumper has been damaged. So the person jumps out of the car and says, look, I'm so sorry I hit your car. I can't afford any points on my license. My insurance will go up. Let me pay for the damage. I'll give you $500 to get your car fixed. And you say, okay. So the person pulls out a piece of paper, right? And it says, I, Bob Green, give you, CeeLo Green, $500 to repair your bumper. And you sign it. That's a release. Even if the damage that the person caused to your car was not $500, but $5,000, you have no recourse. Why? You relieve them from any legal liability. Number 3, we have a covenant not to sue. Now, a covenant not to sue is a legal agreement in which a party seeking damages agrees not to sue the party that has caused the damages. Essentially, a covenant not to sue is the same thing as a release. Now, finally, we have promissory estoppel. Reasonable reliance on a promise may form a basis for enforceable contract rights and duties under the doctrine of promissory estoppel or detrimental reliance. If there is 1, a promise; 2, the promisee's justifiable reliance on the promise; 3, the reliance is of a substantial and definite character; and 4, justice would best be served by enforcing the promise. Now, this is an all or nothing proposition. Each requirement must be met or promissory estoppel will not apply. Basically, what it's saying is if a person makes you a promise and you're justified in believing that promise, and the promise is specific, the promisor is stopped from breaking the promise. Now, the doctrine of promissory estoppel was developed in New York State in an 1897 case where you had a young lady from a society family, a wealthy family, who decided to be a modern woman and get a job. Now, during that time period, it was scandalous for a woman from a good family to work. So the young lady's father said if she agreed not to work, he would pay her yearly wages. He was rich. He was her dad. She believed him. What did she do? She quit her job. Now, because she stayed home, she wasn't worried about money immediately. So 6 months go by, and she asked her father for her 6 months' wages because she wanted to purchase something for herself. Her father refused to give her the money. She said, but Dad, you said if I stopped working, you would pay me my yearly wages. All I'm asking for is what you promised. He responded saying, you just did what a good daughter should do. She got angry, so she sued her father for breach of contract. And in this case, the court ruled that because he made a promise And because she was justified in relying on his promise, and the reliance was a substantial and definite character, specifically, if you don't work, I will pay your wages, justice would best be served by making the father pay his daughter as he promised to do. Now that's 1897, so that's unlikely to happen now because most people don't worry about their daughters or their wives working. But there's a possibility that you might receive a job offer, right? Let's say you are a weather person in Ohio. Now, I don't know how these things work, but let's say the executive producer for Good Morning America comes and has a business lunch with you in which the producer offers you a job. He says, if you show up at my office on September 1st, we will have a position for you, right? You will be our weather person for the next 2 years going forward. You're thrilled to death. You shake hands. So what do? You go and quit the job that you have. You sell the house that you live in. You pack your stuff in a truck and you drive to New York. September 1st, you knock on his door and say, I'm here for the job. The man says, who are you? Why are you here? He said, I'm here for the job you promised me. He said, I didn't promise you anything. Get out. Now, because he made a promise and you were justified in relying on the promise, if this is how it works in the industry, and he was very specific about the details of the promise, if you come here, you will have a job, he will be stopped from making a promise because justice is best served by requiring him to pay.